Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Peter Gaiman, professor of Old Testament and Biblical Languages at Shepherd Seminary. This podcast is dedicated to discussing issues related to Scripture and theology. For more information, visit petergaiman.com. Well, on today's podcast episode, we are going to do something a little risky. We are going to talk about an issue in which no English translation, except for one, agrees with me. So if you're interested in controversy, today's episode will be for you. Basically, what we're going to talk about today is the issue that is in Genesis 4:7. Now, there are two reasons for talking about this. The first one is that I finally got around to putting it into a blog article. I've been meaning to do that for quite a while now. I finally got into putting it into the blog article, and really it was well received by a lot of people. It got a lot of shares and likes and views. And I was really impressed because I anticipated not very many people reading it because it was a pretty technical article regarding Hebrew and how Hebrew functions and things like that. And it also goes against every English translation out there. So I was pretty pleased with the reception that I saw, and I wanted to do a podcast episode on it to kind of explain some of the ramifications and to give people who didn't have time to read it, but they wanted to listen about it, give them an opportunity to think about it as we work through it. So this isn't just going to be a repeat of the blog article, although I'll link to the blog article in the show notes, but it is going to be a discussion of Genesis 4:7 and whether or not we should translate it as sin crouching at the door or not. Now, just as a little history behind this idea, I remember in seminary sitting in Dr. Barrick's Genesis 1-11 class. Phenomenal class. I loved it. And we translated Genesis 1-11, talked about many of the exegetical issues that were involved with that. It was really so impactful for me just to solidify my grasp of Hebrew, but then also just to see all of the neat issues that are involved in the early chapters of Genesis. And as a side note too, I should say Dr. Barrick is working on a Genesis commentary, and I've heard good things about how much work he's put in and how he hopes to have that done in the next couple of years. So I'm really looking forward to that. In my mind, it's going to be probably the best commentary out there on Genesis. But it was in that class when we were translating Genesis 4:7 where I first was introduced to this idea. And I remember Dr. Barrick lecturing on Genesis 4:7, and he had brought up this idea that perhaps sin is better translated as sin offering in Genesis 4. I had never heard in Genesis 4. I had never heard that before, and it seemed irrational to me. And it seemed like one of those times where, okay, Dr. Barrick is a genius, but perhaps this is one of those areas where his genius has kind of corrupted him to common sense. That's literally what I was thinking. And so I was faced with the reality, perhaps this is the one time in my life where I'll be disagreeing with Dr. Barrick, I guess, because it just seemed so foreign, and every English translation I'd ever read would never translate sin as sin offering. It was insane. Now, one of the things I should note at the beginning, though, as we're kind of introducing this subject, is that it is actually valid. The word that is for sin, chatat, in Hebrew, can also be translated as sin offering, depending on the context. So it is actually true. In fact, if you look at the stat, 35 times in reference to sin offering. So it is actually true that there are references with this word to sin and to sin offering. So it is actually a contextual decision. And so it's not as crazy as it might seem, at least out of the gate. But I don't know. As I was thinking about it, I was faced with, okay, I've never heard this before. This seems like it might be stretching it, certainly. Now, one of the reasons it's actually brought up, and this is how this verse, Genesis 4:7, gets complicated a little bit, is because in interpretation circles, Genesis 4:7 is often viewed as the grid for interpreting Genesis 3:16. So in Genesis 3:16, one of the elements that comes up is in God's curse and explanation of the consequences of the fall. In verse 16, it says, he said to the woman, explanation of the consequences of the fall. In verse 16, it says, He said to the woman, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. And then you have this phrase, your desire shall be contrary to your husband. That's the ESV's rendering. Your desire shall be contrary to your husband, but he shall rule over you. Now, the Christian Standard Bible, NAS, translates it a little differently. It would say your desire will be for your husband, yet he will rule over you. So the prepositions there have to be contextually determined. So the big discussion is whether this is a positive desire for one's husband or a negative desire for one's husband to usurp the authority. And in many of the complementarian circles, those who believe that there are differences in roles between men and women, Genesis 3:16 is often a passage that is brought out as an example of a woman when in the marriage relationship, she is often tempted to usurp the authority of her husband. And so the desire will be contrary to your husband, or the desire will be for your husband, is often thought of in these circles as being a desire to usurp authority or to control or to manipulate. And the number one defense of this view is brought out by Genesis 4:7, because Genesis 4:7, there, in this viewpoint, it is clearly sin that has a desire for Cain. And so the desire that sin has for Cain must be negative. Therefore, just one chapter earlier in Genesis 3:16, you have a desire there that must also be negative. So the desire of the woman for her husband must be negative, just like the desire that sin has for Cain in Genesis 4:7. So these are mutually interpretive. If you think of it, that desire is unique. There are actually only three places that it shows up: Genesis 3:16, Genesis 4:7, and then surprisingly, or strangely perhaps, in Song of Solomon 7:10. Song of Songs 7:10, you have there the mention of the desire for one's spouse. And there it's very clearly a positive desire. So that makes it complicated, because if it was only negative contexts, then it would be pretty easy to determine what the desire is. But if the desire is in Song of Songs 7, between a man and a woman, a good, wholesome desire, then what about Genesis 3:16? Could it be a good, wholesome desire there between a man and a woman? And that's the debate, which has run down the ages. And part of the discussion is in Genesis 4:7. So when we're thinking of Genesis 4:7, the issue of what is sin and its fast forward in my own story, as I sat under Dr. Barrick, we were going through Genesis 4, and I logged it away thinking, well, that seems kind of crazy, but at least Dr. Barrick's really smart, so I'll remember it that way. But then as I graduated from seminary and I ended up moving to North Carolina, started teaching as I was preparing for teaching Old Testament survey classes, and I was studying Genesis. I was working through Genesis 4, and I actually came across a couple articles. I was reading two works, well, one in particular by Michael Morales, and he was writing a book in the Gray Biblical Theological Series. I can't remember the full name, but it's edited by D.A. Carson, and it was on Leviticus, and the title of the book was "Who Shall Ascend to the Hill of the Lord?" Who shall ascend, based on the Psalms, where the question is asked, who may ascend to the hill of the Lord? And asked, who may ascend to the hill of the Lord? And the explanation is that Leviticus answers that question. And it was in that book that Morales actually made a passing comment to Genesis 4:7. And I remember thinking, that's kind of crazy. Why is he talking about that? So I looked at his footnotes, and he had written an article called "Crouching Demon, Hidden Lamb: Resurrecting an Exegetical Fossil in Genesis 4:7. So I began to research this. You know how I think everybody kind of has this propensity to go down rabbit holes, which I think is really good. So I started going down this Genesis 4:7 rabbit hole. And what I realized in reading Morales' article is that he pointed to an article by John DeYoung, who wrote an article called, quote, "A Sin Offering Crouching at the Door, Translation Lessons from an Exegetical Fossil in the Judson Bible." And so what DeYoung noted in his article is that you have Adoniram Judson, you have Adam through Matthew Henry, Young's literal translation. All of these English translations had observed that chatat should or can be translated as sin offering. And so that was kind of interesting to me, noting that this actually in the past was actually a rather well-known translation of Genesis 4:7, recognizing it as a sin offering rather than sin. And so it really prompted me to even explore it more because, okay, it's crazy if you just look at all the modern translations because there are no modern English translations that agree with this. But as you go through this, you recognize, okay, maybe there is something that to be argued with regard to this. And so one of the things to understand here with regard to translating this verse, and everyone agrees when scholars are working through this that the number one complicating factor is with regard to gender with this phrase. And part of the reason that this is such an issue is because, well, English doesn't really have gender with regard to words and modifiers. So in many languages, you have modifiers that are going to agree with the noun in person, gender, number. So that's how many languages work. Greek works that way. Hebrew works that way. Spanish works that way. There are so many languages that work that way. And maybe if you understand anything about Spanish, you could know this example. The word for house in Spanish is casa, and the word for small in Spanish is pequeña or pequeño. And that's the point, is that pequeño as a adjective is going to be, the ending is going to change depending on which word it modifies. So if the word was modifying a masculine noun, so for example, the small duck would be el pato pequeño, right? Because duck, pato, is masculine. But if it's going to be a feminine word like la casa, then you're going to end it in an A to modify the feminine noun. So la casa pequeña is going to be the way that that's phrased. So that's typically how languages which observe gender, masculine, feminine, and Greek has a third, neuter, you have them taking different endings to show what words they're modifying. And so that's pretty typical in languages. English just doesn't have a ready category for that because English is a bit of a mutt and a strange language at that. So when we think of that, grammar really does matter. And that's why I'm really thankful. I know my mother will listen to my episodes on occasion. So if you're listening, Mother, thank you for pay off. And I did tell my mother that I would never use grammar, but she was right. I was wrong. I was an idiot. She was very smart. There you go. It's true. So in Genesis 4:7, the word for sin or sin offering is chatat. Chatat is a feminine word. However, what's interesting in Genesis 4:7 is that the words that modify chatat are masculine. And that's very, very strange. It's strange in any language, but it's especially strange in Hebrew. And so chatat, being feminine, is modified by the word, which is usually translated in English as crouching. So in Hebrew, it's rovetz. It's a participle that is masculine singular. And those of you who know Hebrew can hear it. It's rovetz. So there's no rovetza or rovetzet. There's nothing like that. It's not feminine. It's masculine. And then in addition, when it says itzhukato, you hear the O at the end of that. Teshukato. In Hebrew, the O at the end is a masculine pronoun. And so it's kind of like Spanish with regard to that. The O at the end is a masculine modifier. So if that's true, why do you have these masculine modifiers when chatat is very clearly feminine? When sin offering is feminine, you have these masculine modifiers here. That just seems very strange. Now, most people don't have a real good reason for why this might be. And so they just kind of say, well, whatever, we know what it's talking about. But this kind of does really relate to the issue of whether or not we should translate Genesis 4:7 as sin or sin offering. And so when you think about the examples here of other uses of chatat, the word for sin offering, and where that might show up in the Hebrew Bible being modified by being modified by a masculine noun, we have words that exist in Exodus 29:14 and in Leviticus. Well, there are a few others as well, but these are the clearest examples. So in Exodus 29:14, we read about a sin offering. And so we're told, "But the flesh of the bull and its skin and its dung you shall burn with the fire outside the camp. It is a sin offering." Now the "it" there in Hebrew, it is a sin offering. The "it" there is a masculine. But that doesn't make sense because there's supposed to be agreement with sin offering unless the sin offering that's being offered is masculine. Okay, so the bull, the offering, the flesh of the bull and its skin, that's what's being referred to as a masculine entity. And in Exodus 29:14, an offering context of a masculine pronoun or referent there. Something similar is actually going on in Leviticus 4:21 and 23 through 24. In Leviticus 4:21, we read, "He shall carry the bull outside the camp and burn it up, as he burned the first bull. It is the sin offering for the assembly." Same thing there. It's a masculine pronoun being used with the feminine sin offering. Okay? Now, the big takeaway here is that it's certainly rare to have masculine modifiers, but the examples that we do have are when the sin offerings are being referred to as a male, a bull, a goat, etc. So that actually would solve the dilemma of why there's a disagreement between masculine and feminine if we allow it to be a context of sin offering. At least to my knowledge, I am not aware of any other examples where you have sin being referred to by masculine pronouns. But there are actually a handful of examples where you have masculine pronouns referring to the feminine sin offering. So I think that's actually a pretty strong argument that this may be a reference to a sin offering in Genesis 4:7, not a reference to sin. Now, I should say too here at this point that even if you look at the context itself, so if you look at the context, you would also say that this is a context of sacrifice and offering. So if you look at Genesis 4, the whole story is about how Cain and Abel gave an offering and a sacrifice to God. We're told in verse 3 of chapter 4, "In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground." And then verse 4 says, "Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions." Also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. And then it says, "The Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering, he had no regard." Right? So this is the context. It is of sacrifice and offering up, in Cain's case, something from the fruit of the ground, and in Abel's case, something of the flock. So this is certainly an example of sacrifice and offerings. And then so in verse 7, that's actually part of why God is talking to Cain, is because Cain, we're told in verse 5, Cain was very angry and his face fell. And the Lord says, "Why are you angry? Why is your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door." Now, the typical interpretation of this passage then, if it's making a reference to sin, is that, well, listen, sin is crouching right outside the door of the tent, presumably, and we ought not to imagine our doors swinging on the hinges or anything like that, but in a tent-like structure, sin is waiting out there, ready. It's crouching down, ready to pounce as soon as you exit. So you need to be on your guard, and you need to do the right thing. Now, regardless, I think God's discussion with Cain here has to be taken as a warning. But I would advocate something else here. I think that what God could be telling Cain here is that if you mess up, there is a way to reconcile with me, and it's through a sin offering. It's through reconciliation through a sin offering. And this is the means that I have provided for you. The sin offering is crouching at the door. Now, I want to say something about that, because obviously the translations that translate sin as crouching at the door are tipping their head, right? Because this same word for crouching, rovates, is how I told you it was before. Rovates, the Hebrew word itself is not necessarily indicative of an animal that's crouching ready to pounce. It's just a generic word for lying down, and it can be peaceful, tranquil. In fact, you're probably familiar with Psalm 23. I think many of us have memorized that psalm. He makes me lie down in green pastures. Well, that phrase, he makes me lie down, to lie down there, is ravats, the same word that shows up here in Genesis 4:7. So nobody would ever interpret Psalm 23 saying, well, the Lord causes us to lie down ready to pounce on our enemies or something like that. Well, obviously not. That's not how we ought to interpret Psalm 23. And we need to understand that the word ravats isn't necessarily a negative term in and of itself. So the interpreters have made that decision for us by trying to translate it as crouching, but that's really not the nuance of the word. The word simply just means to lie down, to recline, to relax. And so it can be of a lion lying down, but it can also be of us lying down like sheep, relaxing by pleasant streams in green pastures. So the idea of lying down doesn't have to be a negative, ready to pounce idea. So what Genesis 4:7 could be contributing then to our discussion is that it could be talking about how God has made a way of reconciliation for Cain. You messed up, Cain. You're angry. You've sinned. You messed up with your offering. Obviously, it says the Lord didn't regard Cain's offering, so something's wrong. So the way that you can reconcile with me is offer the sin offering, which is lying there at the door. Now, that's another thing in interpreting sin. Really, we're trying to paint a metaphor of our idea. I know one of the ways growing up that I would often try to ambush my mom or my brothers. For some reason, I didn't really do it much with my dad, probably because I feel like I would have died if I would have tried it with my dad. But I would wait right behind the door. And as soon as somebody would walk through the door, I'd jump out and say, boo! I'd scare them and try to scare their socks off, as it were. But one of the realities is that that's not the typical layout of an ancient world existence. You don't have a door with hinges. You don't have a door. You would have an opening in a tent, and it's a little more difficult to imagine kind of hiding by the door ready to ambush. That seems like a strange illustration that I actually don't see anywhere else in Scripture. This would be a pretty unique metaphor if the idea is that sin is waiting to pounce just outside the door there. I mean, I'm sure there might be some context for that, but it is a little more strange than we often readily assimilate it because of our context. But I think it's a little stranger if you put it into their context. But I would say that if you understand this to be translated as sin offering, the understanding of door actually is a little easier to understand. And that's because the word for door here, which simply is the Hebrew word for opening, so it's just the typical word for opening, but how it's used in the Hebrew Bible is rather interesting because it's regularly used for the entrance to the tabernacle. So you can look at Exodus 29 for that, Exodus 38, Exodus 40. There's many, many examples. Leviticus. This is the place that is identified in legal literature, both in where one enters into the tabernacle presence and where one slaughters his sacrifice. This is where the sacrifice is brought, according to Leviticus 1:3. You bring the sacrifice to the door of the tabernacle, the opening. Now, what would that indicate if we take that kind of understanding to Genesis 4? Well, here's kind of my foregoing thought, which was really, really influenced by Morales when I read his article. Is his point was that if you got kicked out of the Garden of Eden, which Adam and Eve did get kicked out, so they were kicked out to the east of the garden, and we're told in Genesis 3:24 that a cherub was placed there at the door, at the entrance of the garden. And so the question is, what do you do then as Adam and Eve then? Well, if we understand Genesis 3:15 as a promise of a coming Redeemer who is going to right what is wrong with the world, 3:15 as a promise of a coming Redeemer who is going to right what is wrong with the world, Adam and Eve would have had at least a rudimentary understanding of the fact that sin is not going to be the only existence for mankind. We're going to have another existence that's going to be brought about by a Redeemer. Well, what's the point of traveling the furthest away from the presence of God? I mean, if I were Adam and Eve, I would stick my tent right next to that entrance. I'd be talking to the cherub every day. I'd be saying, hey, can we get back in yet or not? And so it's likely that what you have going on in Genesis 4 is an existence of Adam and Eve and their family, which is close to the Garden of Eden. I mean, yes, they were kicked out of the Garden of Eden, but why go far away? Why not stay as close as you can? Because that place, the Garden of Eden, is associated with the presence of God. That is where God dwells, just like the tabernacle. So when they offer their sacrifices and the offerings, where do you think it's most likely that they're going to offer it? They are most likely going to offer their sacrifices and offerings as close to God as they can get. That seems to make most sense. And so I think that they're offering that at the door to the Garden of Eden. And so I think that that is probably the reference here when it says the sin offering is lying at the door. In other words, or at the opening. What God is saying is that the sin offering is available to be offered at the entrance to the garden. And now the next phrase, though, is hard no matter which view you take it. So you could remember the modifier here, its desire is masculine, so it'd have to be his desire is for you, and you must rule over him. So that's how it should be translated if you take the masculine reference there. Now, Morales and others have, if you take the masculine reference there. Now, Morales and others have taken that as a reference to Abel. And I think that's definitely possible. I think that's maybe even more likely given the referent of Abel just a few verses earlier, right? So in other words, what God is saying is what you need to do. Abel's desire is for you. So in other words, with regard to the conflict between Cain and Abel, it's not as if Abel is hoping Cain fails. No, his desire is for Cain's well-being, and it's Cain's responsibility to rule over Abel. That is the typical way that Morales and others have taken it. In fact, what's interesting is that seems to be how the Septuagint translates it as well. As a reminder, the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the first translation that we have access to, made into the Greek language. And the Greek Septuagint, I'm using the Lexham English Septuagint to provide a translation here. The Lexham English Septuagint translates Genesis 4:7 as, "Have you not sinned if you offer rightly, but do not divide rightly? Be still, his recourse will be to you, and you will rule him." So that seems to be the translation that the Septuagint follows, which, again, the first translation, where the Septuagint translates Genesis 4:7 as a reference to a sacrifice as well as to Abel. Now, another possibility here would be that the masculine reference could be a reference offering itself. But the difficulty there, it's not a difficulty that it's masculine, because we already showed that sin offerings, if they are masculine, they can be referred to by the masculine pronoun. But the difficulty then would be to interpret what exactly is the desire. It's easier to understand how Abel would have a desire that is for the benefit of Cain. But it's harder to imagine the sin offering having a desire for the benefit of Cain. But I think if you took this as sin, you'd be working metaphorically. So if you interpreted this as sin crouching at the door, that's a metaphor. And so possibly, if you wanted to try that out, I think it's possible that the sin offering has a desire for Cain, meaning metaphorically, the sin offering exists for the benefit of Cain. And that's what the sin offering is for. It's the desire of the sin offering to benefit Cain. I think that's a normal way of interpreting that. And then the word for rule here, you must rule over it. That doesn't mean it's domineering or that you need to control it or anything like that. The word for rule is a generic idea here, which has to be determined by context. It's the same concept where you have the sun and the moon in Genesis 1, and the sun is said, the greater light rules the day, the lesser light rules the night. So that phrase concept, that's the same word here for rule. And so when you think of just what kind of rule is being talked about, it's not a negative rule. It's not necessarily even an overpowering rule. It's a rule of caretaking and stewardship, right? So stewardship, I think, might be a good way of thinking through this last phrase. And so there are, admittedly, this last phrase, I would say, is the most difficult. If there was maybe a different phrase, I think it would be slam dunk, easy to translate this as sin offering. But this phrase complicates things a little bit, but I don't think it's insurmountable. I think like the Septuagint, the way that they understood it, being very close to, Septuagint, Genesis is probably translated around 250 BC. The way that they translated that is a very ancient translation then, and they very clearly viewed it as a reference to Abel. So that has more consistency to it. That's the ancientness of the translation, if you will. And so that's something we should definitely consider. I lean slightly toward viewing this as the desire of the sin offering, but it's barely, maybe 55-45 with regard to that. I think that it's entirely possible. It is talking about Abel's desire as well. Now, all that, this has been pretty technical stuff, but if you've been following, you understand then that in context, this isn't just a way out. In other words, helping Cain understand that you aren't doomed to irreconcilable status with God. But if you would like to be accepted, if you would like to do well, you have a sin offering there in order to reconcile. And that is in either case, Cain is commanded somehow to rule over it or rule over him, either with reference to the sin offering or to Abel. So in other words, God reminds Cain of his obligation to do the right thing as the master and steward in the family to take care of this issue. And then that would be the major contrast, because then in verse 8 we find out that God's advice is not taken by Cain, but rather Cain turns his back on God and slaughters his brother. And remember, Abel is innocent of anything. Abel was offering a sacrifice. Cain was offering his offering and brother. And remember, Abel is innocent of anything. Abel was offering a sacrifice. Cain was offering his offering. And God rejected Cain's offering. And instead of fixing things, instead of reconciling himself with God, Cain doubles down and kills, presumably out of envy, Abel. Anger and envy. And so it really is a travesty. But I think that understanding verse 7 as a sin offering and not as sin actually helps us understand that narrative a little better. And so I would definitely advocate that understanding. Now, if we go full circle, I know we've been talking a lot about Genesis 4:7, but if we go full circle, perhaps this will be another podcast episode at a later time, but how does this relate to one's understanding of Genesis 3:16? I actually had a comment on the blog article asking that very question, and I'm happy to. Pain and childbearing, in pain you shall bring forth children. And then that's obviously the consequence. You might even be able to say curse, but it's actually clear that only the ground and the serpent are cursed in Genesis 3. But these are certainly the consequences that the woman receives for the sin. And the childbearing, the pain in this process is a very significant consequence. But the next phrase I would actually take as a blessing in the midst of judgment. Or as James Hamilton wrote his biblical theology, he called it salvation in the midst of judgment. And I think that's God's MO, honestly. And this was one of my papers that I wrote in seminary. In writing on Genesis 3:16, I actually went through Genesis 1-11, showing how in all of these cycles of sin and judgment, there seemed to be themes of salvation and mercy in the midst. There seemed to be themes of salvation and mercy in the midst of them. And I think that that's a really important aspect to this. So I would say Genesis 3:16 should actually be interpreted as an element of mercy. In other words, God's saying pain is going to be a big part of your life now. You're going to have pain in bearing children and bringing forth children. But your desire will still be for your husband. Your desire will still be for your husband, and he will still rule over you. That's how I would kind of translate it. So in other words, the desire there is positive. In other words, even though there's pain through the childbirth and everything like that, that doesn't mean that that pain is going to separate you from your husband. You still will have a desire for your husband. And he will still exercise the rule and stewardship and care over you that he ought to have exercised prior to the fall. That is going to continue even post-fall. So I think that that actually makes a better understanding of 3:16. And I would also say, again, future episode, but I would also say that fits in with the broader scope of this context in Genesis 3, because in Genesis 3, it's kind of odd that you would have multiple ramifications, or I should say multiple judgments brought upon the woman for sin when the other characters like the serpent and the man. And so I think that this is a better way of understanding this in Genesis 3:16. Now, either way, I would say the argument for Genesis 4:7 kind of stands on its own. I think that that's a separate issue, but it's obviously related, right? Because these two passages are two of the three passages that have the word desire. So you're going to have to talk about both of these passages in the same discussions usually. But I would just want to throw out this understanding of Genesis 4:7 as a possibility. I think that it's definitely not in the contemporary newer translations, but I would advocate that newer is not always better. I think that some of the older translations were probably more correct in translating this verse, Genesis 4:7, as sin offering, not as sin. Now, one of the things that I would put out here as a realm of thinking, I don't think not as sin. Now, one of the things that I would put out here as a realm of thinking, I don't think I read this anywhere else. I don't know. This seems like it's something that I was thinking about. But if I got it from somewhere, I'm sorry I didn't cite them because my thoughts are always jumbled up. But the reality is, I think one of the reasons why we have all of these translations translating it as sin rather than sin offering is twofold. One would be the influence of the KJV. So the KJV, the King James Version, once that translates a passage, everybody consults that. That is the standard English translation and understanding of passages for 400 years of the English language. And so it's rather foolish to minimize that influence, right? So that's going to be a big part of the future translations that come out. Absolutely doesn't have a prominent existence in English translations is because of the prominence of critical biblical studies. And what I mean by that is in higher circles, higher education, there is a typical viewpoint. In fact, you might be familiar with the idea of JEPD. So JEPD was a theory advocated about the study of the Pentateuch in particular, where the foregoing theory, and this was the prominent theory in Old Testament studies for years in the modern world, from the 1800s basically through the 1900s into the 21st century. It's not as prominent today, but through many of those who are influenced in Bible translation, this was one of the theories that they were taught. And they were taught that the Pentateuch was made up of a variety of sources. And so you have the JEPD, you have taught. And they were taught that the Pentateuch was made up of a variety of sources. And so you have the JEPD, you have at least 4 different sources: the Yahweh source, the Jehovah source, the priestly source, and the Deuteronomic source. And so the priestly source is the source that has the highest development of religious activity, sacrifices, offerings, etc. So what many scholars proposed is that Genesis 4 actually is kind of out of the ordinary because it seems to show that there's sacrifices and offerings going on, but that can't have developed yet. And by the way, the secular foundation of the JEPD theory, it was basically Darwinism and evolutionary development. So the foregoing theory is that you have to have something develop from the simple to the complex. And so to say that Cain and Abel and primitive mankind, and so a lot of people bought into that. And I think that contributed both directly and indirectly to those who read these other scholars about a hesitancy to see a full orb discussion of sacrifice and sin offering and what have you in Genesis 4. But I think, like I said, this seems to be the early view of the Septuagint. At least the Septuagint did recognize this was a sacrificial context and translated it somewhat in accordance with that, right? And so I think that it's helpful to go back to the basics, saying, okay, what is the context of Genesis 4? It's a sacrificial context. Could this be translated as sin offering? Does that make sense in the broader context? I would argue that it does. And I would argue that it solves many of the grammatical issues of sin offering being a feminine noun, but yet having masculine modifiers in Genesis 4:7. So it's one of those things where I think it's fun to think about. I'm not calling it yet having masculine modifiers in Genesis 4:7. So it's one of those things where I think it's fun to think about. I'm not calling anyone a heretic if they translate Genesis 3:16 or Genesis 4:7 in this case as sin, and Genesis 3:16 as a negative aspect based on Genesis 4:7. That is definitely the most popular view today. But I would just advocate there are definitely some things to think about, and I personally would give my vote to translating Genesis 4:7 as sin offering. But it's an ongoing discussion. I think that there's going to be more and more studies on this issue as time goes by, but I think it's really helpful for us to think about. Well, I hope it's been helpful and fun to think through this issue. As always, you can reach out to me through the contact form on my website, petergaiman.com. I always enjoy hearing from listeners, and I was particularly encouraged over the last few weeks. I'll continue to do that. If there's any way I can be helpful, I would love to do that. Pray for me as it's the end of the semester, and I'm doing a lot of grading and trying to balance a lot of different items at the end of the semester. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you and make his face shine upon you.